This particular chapter questions before seismic sounding, radio echo sounding, and ice coring. It looks at the time when explorers still lacked the scientific instruments to look vertically down into the ice sheet. So what they were faced with was a unbroken white topography for the most part. What could they do with that? How could they, in a sense, bring back what they encountered? And part of that bringing back is, of course, visual representation. Only what they were seeing profoundly challenged the production and the aesthetic canons of the time. The first expeditions to make inroads up and onto the marginal regions of the Greenland ice sheet were those by the Swedish geologist Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld in 1870 and 1883. So this Swedish explorer, Nordenskjöld, was accompanied by the botanist Sven Bergen and a handful of Greenlanders, Inuits. Nordenskjöld made his way to the foot of the ice sheet and managed to travel some 70 kilometers inland. What he and his companions discovered was an ice cape shaped and defined by the processes of melt and precipitation, typical of the ice sheet's marginal regions during the summer months. Unlike what would later be discovered further inland, this was a grand and dynamic topography that comprised crevices, chasms, melt ponds, and rivers extending tens of kilometers into the interior. In its dynamic wilderness, it resembled in many ways the European Alps. It evoked the sublime and corresponded to the prevailing aesthetic of the time, which was classicism and romanticism. Indeed, the sketches drafted by Bergen and later turned into woodcut illustration for Nordenskjöld's expedition account echoed paintings of the Alps by such notorious British artists as William Turner, who you may or may not be familiar with, and John Ruskin, but these were eminent romantic painters who worked in the European Alps for the most part. They also, however, evoked lesser-known Alpine artists and photographers, in whose works we can see here human figures dwarfed by the power of ice. So these are the Greenland woodcuts, and these are images from the Alps. It's just to make this comparison that, in fact, the edges of the ice sheet were, in some ways, aesthetically familiar. During his second Greenland expedition, then in 1883, Nordenskjöld journeyed even deeper, this time 120 kilometers inland. There, seeing that some of his companions were approaching exhaustion, he decided to turn back. Not, however, before sending out two of his lap companions, Paua Lars Tuorda and Anders Rossa, for a final dash on skis. The Lap's mission was to travel due east as far as they could for 4 days, and to see if they could find, in Nordenskjöld's own words, an El Dorado of yore, an open land area at the center of Greenland, harboring grassland and forests. In actual fact, as they skied further 230 kilometers inland, what the Lapps discovered was not an El Dorado, but a vast flat desert of ice that seemed to extend uninterrupted all the way to the east coast. This was a pure ice cape, as uninhabited as it was uninhabitable, what Nordenskjöld himself came to call the Sahara of the Arctic regions, one from which they brought back no images, except for that departure. The next chapter in the early surface exploration of ice sheets corresponded to the first expeditions to either cross Greenland's ice sheets in its entirety or to explore the Antarctic ice sheet. The first of these expeditions was the Norwegian Front Fridtjof Nansen's 1887 Greenland expedition, in which he and 5 companions took 41 days to cross the ice sheet from east to west. Here you see his traverse. Not only did Nansen this expedition prove grueling work in some of the most difficult climatic conditions to be found anywhere on Earth, in Nansen's own words, I quote, "It was simply inordinarily monotonous, with not a trace of any important occurrence. We toiled across an interminable flat desert of snow. One day began and ended like another, and all were characterized by nothing but a wearisome uniformity. Flatness and whiteness were the two features of this ocean of snow. In the day we could only see three things: the sun, the snowfield, and ourselves. In the absence of any topographic features, the only thing left to photograph with the little portable camera that was carried by the expedition were the explorers themselves. Indeed, the photographs that were brought back constituted what fellow historian James Ryan has described as the building blocks of the modern myth of the explorer, in which the heroic individual pits his very being against a harsh environment in order to attain some ideal. I think you can really see that struggle there in this photograph. Exploration as a process of physical and material contact and exchange. This is perhaps even more striking in the woodcut later made from the photographs I've just shown you. It shows the exact same scene, but this time with the extra figure of Nansen added to the left of the frame here. You see him striding forward, eyes fixed authoritatively onto the horizon. Again, this sort of heroic stance. The ice sheet eventually becomes more apparent as a visual subject in the photographs brought back by the American explorer Robert Peary in his 1892 traverse of the northern portion of the Greenland ice sheet. Here you see his expedition right at the northern end of Greenland. The photographs emphasize the ice sheet surface destitution of scale and perspective as a result from an absence of topographic features. Without so much as a geographic coordinate providing a clue as to the location where he might be standing. Astrup, Peary's companion, appears as lost in a topographic limbo. Even more pronounced, however, was Peary's photograph like a great bed of white lava, which appears to be the first photographic image to focus specifically on the ice sheet surface without any characters or any explorers in the frame or even traces of their traverses. What this image captures is a topography of absence. As such, it corresponds to an aesthetic that might best be described as the unknowing precursor of a sort of modernist abstraction. Indeed, in its visual abstraction, it also challenges the foundation of placemaking within the context of the geography of place and space. As geographer Yi-Fu Tuan contends, space is abstract. It lacks content. It is broad, open, and empty. For space to be turned into place, it must be endowed with meaning and value, whether this be cultural, scientific, social, or indeed visual. But as represented in this photograph, the topographic and biotic desolation of the ice sheet surface resists such transformations. It offers nothing for meaning and value to even begin to hang on to or to germinate. This is space that cannot become place yet. And in a way, this sort of space becomes place later with the vertical perspective, where you might get an ice core, for example, drilled in this particular location. It becomes a coordinate and it starts to tell a story. But right now, there is no story at this point. Okay. Where it comes to Antarctica, the blank surface of the ice sheet did not become a photographic subject until the late 1920s. What preceded it was either an absence of photographic representation or photographs of flag planting. The first party to journey inland over the surface of the Antarctic ice sheet was led by Captain Scott during his British National Antarctic Expedition of 1901 to 1904, in what came to be known as the Western Journey. Where am I? You have the Western Journey here. After a long and arduous ascent through the mountains that extended along the coastline of Victoria Land, Scott reached the top of the Farrar Glacier and began his journey westward across the ice sheet. As he contemplated the frozen horizontality extending before him, Scott wrote in a tone that brings to mind Nansen and Perry's evocations of the Greenland ice sheet. I quote, "I do not think that it would be possible to conceive a more cheerless prospect than that which faced us at this time, when on this lofty, desolate plateau we turned our backs onto the last mountain peak that could remind us of a habitable land." Indeed, while Scott's companion, Reginald Skelton, had taken a series of photographs as they climbed through the marginal regions and mountains, from this point forward, with the mountains behind them, there would be no more images. So these are the images as they're going through the Transantarctic and Farrar Glacier, and then they're up on the ice sheet, the mountains are behind them, and then they keep marching west. All that would be brought back were charts, measurements, and textual accounts. As they slogged towards an altitude of some 10,000 feet and in a temperature as low as minus 40 degrees centigrade, Scott began describing the ice sheet surface as some vivid but evil dream. And the Sostrugi were getting on his nerves. Not only did the ice sheet stand in the way of his ambition to discover a western coastline to Victoria Land as he thought might exist, it began to look as though, on the contrary, it had engulfed or swallowed up this perceived and possible coastline. Finally, having journeyed over 200 miles to the west, Scott decided that the time had come to turn back. At this point, he wrote in his diary, "Greenland, I remembered, would have been crossed in many places by such a track as we have made. But so it was. Here tonight we have reached the end of our tether, and all we have done is show the immensity of this vast plain. The scene about us is the same as we have seen for many a day, and shall see for many a day to come. A scene so wildly and awfully desolate that it cannot fail to impress on one with gloomy thoughts. After all, it is not what we see that inspires awe, but the knowledge of what lies beyond our view. We see only a few miles of ruffled snow bound by a vague, wavy horizon, but we know that beyond that horizon are hundreds and even thousands of miles which can offer no change to the weary eye, while on the vast expanse that one's mind conceives, one knows there is neither tree, nor shrub, nor any living thing, nor even inanimate rock, nothing but a terrible, limitless expanse of snow. It has been for countless years, and it will be for countless more. And we, little human insects, have started to crawl over this awful desert, and are now bent on crawling back again. Could anything be more terrible than this silent, windswept immensity when one thinks such thoughts?" What more can you add to that? When the first photographs were eventually taken on the surface of the Antarctic ice sheet, it was therefore not to reflect the sense of gloom and existential emptiness, but rather to further strengthen the modern myth of the modern explorer, as in Greenland. And as is shown in this photograph of Captain Scott's South Pole Party taken by Byrd Bowers in January 1912 during the fateful Terra Nova expedition to the South Pole. More frequently, however, the camera, when it was used to document and hopefully was used to certify the attainment of a certain goal through the planting of a flag. In these photographs, the Antarctic ice sheet becomes a blank stage for very well-known human stories of success, failure, and primacy. What Catherine Newsoff identifies as a space for possession, a blank page on which the margins of an empire can be writ large. The photographs are not about the ice sheet on which they are taken, but rather about the prizes that simply happen to be located upon it. The trouble, however, was that in contrast to the summit of a mountain, at the southern magnetic poles, there was no reward of a panorama. There was nothing to see or smell, nothing to observe or experience that was in any way differentiable from any other location for millions of square kilometers around. As Twan might have argued, these remained locations without a physical or sensual aura. In this context, images of explorers standing next to flags unwittingly emphasize the fact that on the surface of ice sheets, photography was unable to visually differentiate one location from another. The strongest expression of this resistance to visual representation and visual placemaking, however, ultimately came not from the ground, but from the air. Not from the surface explorers, but from the aviators and the new field of vision which they introduced. Most notably from the pioneering Antarctic flights of Richard E. Byrd and Lincoln Ellsworth. As you will all know, on the 28th of November 1929, Byrd made a 17.5-hour return flight from Little America Station on the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf to the South Pole on board a full tri-motor aircraft, the Floyd Bennett. As they flew over the Ross Ice Shelf and then through the Transantarctic Mountains, Byrd's photographer, Ashley McKinley, used a huge Fairchild camera, which you can see on the bottom left, to capture images of the mountainous topography unfolding beneath them. So here they've gone over the Ross Ice Shelf and they're starting to go up and over the Transantarctic Mountains. But once the mountains faded away in the distance behind them, as with Captain Scott before them, there was less and less for his camera to capture. In Byrd's own words, what they were beholding was the last stronghold of inertness. And as the Floyd Bennett came to fly over the pole, without risking a landing, of course, all that McKinley could capture was this absence of anything to mark the scene. After dropping an American flag over the pole, and this is a photograph of the South Pole, as well as the location notes that Byrd wrote on board the plane. And so after dropping an American flag over the pole, Byrd wrote, I quote, "For a few seconds we flew over the spot where Amundsen and Scott had stood 18 years earlier. There was nothing now to mark that scene, only a white desolation and solitude disturbed by the sound of our engines. The pole lay in the center of a limitless plain. No mountains were visible. And that, in brief, is all there is to tell about the South Pole. One gets there, and that is about all there is for the telling. It is the effort to get there that counts." Indeed, this was an achievement that men could appropriate only intellectually. The accomplishment was as sterile as everything else about Antarctica at that time, or as it was perceived to be at that time. Indeed, in considering these images from a purely aesthetic point of view, they might be compared to the most abstract paintings of the suprematist movement. Most especially White on White, which was painted in 1917 by the founder of suprematism, Kazimir Malevich, whose work represented a renunciation of painting, which itself served as a declaration of the end of art. And Malevich was very, very influenced and interested in aerial photography. In this photograph, the horizon line, still visible in Paris like a great bed of white lava, has disappeared because of the vertical angle at which it was taken. As such, it also challenged the ideas of geographers such as Dennis Cosgrove and Bill Fox on the subject of aerial photography, which is that, I quote, "What aerial photography does is to establish a context for individual features on the ground, to place them in relationship to one another and to a broader topography, revealing patterns to the eye, or we might say, to create geographies." Here, in contrast, there was no possible visual light dialogue with the broader topography, no way of creating geographies. This is an image of a space that refuses to become a place once more. Perhaps the most powerful terrestrial incarnation of the idea of the void and the vacuum. Indeed, and to finish, this idea of the void and of the vacuum became perhaps nowhere more apparent than during the first transantarctic flight completed by Ellsworth and his co-pilot, the Canadian Herbert Hollick Kenyon, in November 1935. During this saga of a flight, which ended up taking 22 days, comprised 3 separate landings and weeks of sitting out storms in a tent, Ellsworth used a small Leica camera to document the mountainous topography beneath him, from his point of takeoff on Dundee Island on the peninsula to a range of mountains which he named the Sentinel Range. Past the Sentinel Range, however, there was nothing more to see but the blankness of the ice sheet. At this point, Ellsworth noted, no landmarks visible, only a limited expanse of white. He then proceeded to interrupt his photographing, eager not to waste film on what would only result in blank frames. However, and interestingly, this was a decision that was later criticized by a polar explorer and earth scientist John Roscoe, who wrote that, I quote, Ellsworth said he had no spectacular photographs because no land of any kind protruded through the ice sheet on the inland portion of his journey. It is unfortunate that he did not realize the value of making continuous photographic coverage, since mapping the absence of spectacular landscapes is equal in significance to mapping other types of unexplored terrain. Mapping the absence. This may indeed be the best possible description of the underlying paradox at the heart of the early history of ice sheet photography and representation. So in conclusion, once past the sublime marginal regions of the ice sheets, the reductive topography of the interior challenged visual representation as much as it did the act of exploration. As a result, photographs brought back from the exploration of ice sheet hinterlands focused for the most part on explorers and flag planting. Where explorers did focus solely on the documentation of the ice sheet surface, the resulting images were highly minimalistic and abstract, with very little information content. These not only constitute a form of natural abstraction that resembled abstraction in art, but also characterize the challenge posed by the surface of ice sheets to placemaking and the geography of place and space. Thank you.